This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. This is Common Sense Generation. I'm Kądzielska-Koper, and today we're going to talk about the soul. With me is Ralph Weir, author, philosopher, who's right now working on a book about the history of soul. Ralph, thank you very much for coming here.
It's great to be here.
You have a background of philosophy, Oxford, right, University of Lincoln. You wrote about Mind-Body Problem. And right now you are searching and going through the history of looking at the many theories of the soul. Mm-hmm. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. So something I learned studying the mind-body problem, which is in a way a technical dispute in philosophy that's been going on for thousands of years, but especially since the rise of modern science, is that there's this old answer to the problem, which says, well, we have something called a soul. It's this immaterial entity. It's not a body. It's very different in nature, which appears again and again in different traditions throughout the world across history. And it suddenly became very unpopular around the middle of the 20th century. In 1949, the great British philosopher Gilbert Ryle was able to write that still today most experts in science, philosophy, theology, whatever, think that something like the old soul-body dualist view is true, whereas I would say by maybe like 1960, nobody thought that was the standard view. Everyone, at least in the English-speaking academic world, had accepted that materialism is the correct view, that we're really just bodies. And I also found out, so that puzzled me. What caused this big change? How did we suddenly come to abandon this idea that we've had for so long? And were we really justified in doing so? Looking into it further, I found to my surprise, this wasn't just academic philosophers who changed their minds about this. In a whole host of areas, there's a kind of what I see as a really curious hostility to the idea of the soul. I dubbed this psuchophobia in my existing book, fear of the soul or phobia of the soul.
Fear of the soul, because this is the fear of transcendence. So trying to very often ask very religious questions, or what we already have discussed also with other guests on this podcast, it's very often we in the public sphere we use religious concepts but without the transcendent. Mm-hmm. So the problem of guilt, or the question of guilt, or and we look for something which can be which can fill this gap, religious gap, which I do tend to stand on this opinion that everyone has everyone has some religious intuitions, and they are seeking for something more, and very often tries to answer this with, for example, more some answers like unity or equality, which tend to be, or you're looking for someone to blame just because they cannot fill this religious need which is in them.
Well, I'd say a couple of things about this. First, it's clearly true that a major factor in this turn against the idea of the soul is a wider turn against religion, or withdrawal from traditional religion among Western intellectuals, at least. I don't know, I notice in philosophy, sometimes people try to pin soul-body dualism on Christianity as an argument against Christianity. Sometimes they try to sort of pin religion or Christianity on soul-body dualism as an argument against that. It's not clear which became unpopular first. And although I didn't come to this question initially from a religious perspective, I just thought that here's this fascinating philosophical problem that speaks to all sorts of areas that interest me. increasingly I've seen it as one of a variety of areas in which there is a nervousness about the transcendent, the numinous, the holy, all of these ideas associated with religion, which people have wanted to try to do without. And one conclusion I've come to is we're not going to get rid of the idea of the soul. We might come up with some new terminology to avoid having to speak in that language. But in fact, it seems to be part of our default way of understanding ourselves and the world, to see one another as, in some sense, in-souled beings. And I think likewise, we're not going to get away from transcendent, from the idea of the transcendent, of a moral responsibility that goes beyond our personal preferences as human beings, of the numinous, of the holy. I think these are deep-seated in our nature, and I don't see that going away. But I would add, of the many areas in which I found what I see as this surprising hostility to the idea of the soul, perhaps one of the most surprising is contemporary theology. So
this is interesting.
Yeah. In fact, as my friend Brandon Rickabar, an American philosopher, points out at the start of an article on this, the overwhelming majority of the most vocal Christian thinkers who write about this issue identify as Christian materialists and make an effort to argue that Christianity has always, in fact, believed in the resurrection of the body, but not the immortality of the soul, have taken the view that this idea of the soul is some kind of Greek pagan contamination of the early Christian doctrine. And religion is by no means immune to this phenomenon. I agree with my friend Brandon that this is totally, I don't want to say crazy, because I like a lot of these guys' work. I think they're brilliant thinkers. But the view they've come to seems to me to be demonstrably and importantly wrong.
So religious people who, in the realms of Christianity, who want to be more scientific and try to answer this problem without the aspect of faith.
I think one aspect is a desire to kind of bulletproof their faith against scientific
so the
attack.
soul now become a scapegoat, and as you mentioned, if it's only the Greek idea, of course it is a Greek idea, but the soul exists also in Judaism.
It absolutely exists in intertestamental Judaism prior to Christianity. I think it's there much earlier than that as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Needed to come even, so we cannot just put it only on the Greek philosophers and again on Plato. It has to be. It is also in this tradition, and and Christianity as a progeny of Judaism takes it.
Contemporary cognitive scientists, Paul Bloom in particular, have made a really strong case that this is not something unique to any particular culture, but an idea to which humans come very naturally. And Bloom would say it's some kind of mistake that we do so. I'd say maybe for really good reason.
So coming back to your research, what have you so far found? Like how different nations, or cultures have seen or seek for soul? Yeah,
so, one inspiration for this book was the book I'm writing now, which will be for a general readership and a global history of the idea of the soul. One inspiration was, I think I love the Western tradition in philosophy, but I think it's a shame that we do it so narrowly. It often emerges just out of, if not laziness, then maybe a just sense of being overwhelmed at the other traditions that exist, how much work it would take to engage with them seriously. But of course, it's going to be rewarding work. There were a couple of articles by a guy called Van Norden, who's a brilliant scholar of Chinese philosophy, decrying the way in which we tend to ignore non-Western traditions in our philosophy faculties. And I think, one result of that has been that people don't realize how universal the idea of the soul is. They assume it might have been invented by Plato or by Descartes and then infiltrated Christianity or whatever. I've lately been reading principally the Chinese classics, having spent some time doing Indian philosophy earlier. One interesting difference I noticed there so far, I'm by no means an expert on this yet, is that in the Indian tradition, you get a lot of very direct metaphysical reflection on the nature of the soul or self, the Atman. There are various words used here, as you do to a comparable, but perhaps not quite such a great degree in the early Greek philosophy. In the Chinese tradition that I've read so far, you get this totally distinctive attitude, best represented by Confucius, who says, we must pay our respects to the ghosts and spirits of ancestors, but we shouldn't think about them too much, or something to that effect. You get this pious social attitude to what one assumes is a very long-standing, pre-theoretical tradition that accords a spirit to each person that can survive as an ancestor who continues to participate in religious rituals and so forth. But you don't get that kind of metaphysical analysis. What exactly are these spirits? Are they made of qi, a metaphysical concept that comes in a little later in the Chinese tradition? I expect with further reading I'll find it somewhere. But the social attitudes are very much at the forefront in that tradition.
Well, it's a practical philosophy in Confucianism, very much based on what is here. But that's why it very often needs to be sort of complementary. How could I say it in English?
Taoism or Buddhism?
Taoism, exactly. Yeah. Taoism is a complementary philosophy element to Confucianism.
So I see Taoism, again, on the amount of reading I've been doing for the last sort of 6 months, principally, as, I mean, the really core influential texts also strike me as being principally practical in orientation. Later on, both of these traditions gain a more metaphysical strand that seems to be regarded by many scholars as a lot to do with the interaction with Buddhism, which is, by contrast, a very metaphysically oriented religion, and a really interesting kind of, I mean, someone might say counterexample to what I've been saying, that more or less all cultures historically and globally have this idea of the soul. There's a sense, I think, in which that's absolutely true of Buddhism, but one core tenet of pretty early Buddhist texts, in particular, Nagarjuna in the and then the later Madhyamaka tradition, is this idea that the soul, as well as the rest of empirical reality, is some kind of illusion. So you kind of get just as you have some materialists early on in the Javatka school and Epicurus, you get a kind of precursor to this modern illusionist idea there, which may in fact have started influencing the Western tradition as early as David Hume. I mean, a really interesting thing that comes out of reading all this stuff is that global philosophical traditions are not as isolated as we sometimes assume them to be. There's a great deal of interaction, in particular between ancient Greek philosophy and Buddhism on the one hand, and then ancient Chinese philosophy and Buddhism on the other. It kind of makes sense. You've got India between these two other cultures.
Well, what I found, for example, about political philosophy, that Confucianism is very similar to, and also the story on Confucius is very similar to the story of Socrates, who he wanted to create, or maybe to Plato, more to Plato, but he wanted to create a also political utopia who didn't work out. He had to flee.
This is Common Sense Generation. If you like this channel, please subscribe, share, and comment. Your voice really matters.
Very similar things which Plato did, and they lived on similar time frame as well, but of course in totally different places. But it only comes that certain intuitions, like and such, are similar among humans, because, well, I do tend on this point that we humans are somehow similar as well, and that we want to answer those questions because they are there in us.
Reading the Confucians, I was looking for, I guess, sort of metaphysics, and most of what you get is advice on how you should rule ancient China. Essentially, it's highly sympathetic what they say. The focus on seeking virtuous officials who will act for the good of the people. I mean, a lot of it is just repeating pretty what seem to maybe a modern reader now obviously ethically admirable guidance on how things should be done.
But it comes also from a certain anthropology, which is in it. Today, they understand that in this form, every human being most of the people need some form of guidance, and there should be the same relationship as between children and father can be brought to a bigger perspective, a political perspective, and it occurs between the ruler and the people. But the same care is also there between the ruler and the people. It exists in the family between father and the children.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I think the idea of the family, those relationships, is really central in Confucianism, and there was this early debate. It's the kind of thing we should really teach first year undergraduates, because it's a great way of setting up a problem. You had essentially the Yangist school on the one hand, who seemed to have said, basically, you should just be out for yourself. A little like some of my undergraduates think when they arrive at university.
Because they all read Nietzsche and maybe Ayn Rand. So then they want to be...
Maybe not all of them, but it's a view that people often toy with when they're young and starting to think about these things. At the other extreme, you have the Moists, who say we must have universal love for all of humanity, and we must, act indifferently on that love, no matter who we're dealing with, whether it's your best friend or a total stranger. Also a super appealing view, especially to anyone who's been influenced by Christian ethics. And then you have kind of in the middle the Confucians, who say, well, we should have, as I interpret them, universal love for humanity, but we shouldn't be indifferent about whether someone's, your close family member, your friend. You actually have stronger obligations to some people than you do to other people, which, of course, one thing in its favor is that represents how everyone actually behaves all the time. Whether or not that's what we intuitively tend to feel. You get the Confucians representing what you might think is the common sense view on this question.
There is a lot of definitely practical ways of dealing with problems, which tends to be important, especially when you deal with so many people in the tradition, because Asia is highly populated. It was even there, but now it definitely is. And at least from a political philosophy, what Chinese people, for example, are the most afraid of is something called luan, which is chaos. So they know that without a strong leadership, with such huge amount of people, exists chaos. And if chaos goes into the people, then there is a huge bloodshed, there is a huge loss. And they are so afraid of it, they are even eager to give up lots of their freedom just to have a form of peace and prosperity. And this is this unwritten deal between Chinese people and the Communist Party. As long as Communist Party is giving them financial stability, they are not going to rebel too much.
I find it very interesting, the relationship between the ancient Chinese intellectual traditions and modern China today, especially as to some degree, my impression is that Xi's party has kind of rehabilitated some aspects of Confucianism, suggesting a continuity between these traditions. Earlier on, communist China was really seen as repudiating all of that stuff. I guess that bargain that you describe to a Western philosopher sounds exactly like Hobbes. It's the point, like, we really don't want chaos and bloodshed, and we're willing to sacrifice a bunch of our liberties in order to avoid that. It doesn't seem like an insane thing to do. It would, it's something that somehow we've managed to a significant degree to avoid doing in the democrat, the flourishing democracies of the world. Why exactly that's happened is really, it seems to me, kind of mysterious. There are a whole bunch of theories about it. I think some suggest it's got to do with like these organic institutions that grow up over time and balance powers against each other. So it's not something you can just create deliberately. We're just kind of lucky in a way. There's a relationship. See, a great thing about trying to hubristically write a book that's going to cover even one concept in a global historical way is that you end up thinking about these massive, broad issues that bear on kind of everything that's going on in the world globally today. The book will not say anything about how modern China should be run or that kind of stuff, but it's a great opportunity to think about how this bears on wider issues.
Because it seems like things are connected in philosophy. That's why philosophy is such a beautiful study of everything and nothing.
I think I should add, this may not be totally accurate, but I have read that the CCP has exhibited some anxiety about the continuing prevalence of traditional Chinese religious practices involving principally ritual interaction with the spirit world, in particular the spirits of ancestors. And I don't know, I certainly read one article saying they'd sort of put out a proclamation saying, communism isn't about ghosts, stop doing this stuff. I don't know how accurate that is, but I will perhaps try to get that into the book as an example of modern psychophobia in action.
Well, I can quote to this Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, and their political thinker, who, referring to China and to Confucianism and this idea of very communistic materialism, which he says that China is a mosaic of 3,000 years old or even older. And communism is just a graffiti on it, which is 100 years. The rain will come, it will flush it out, and what stays is Confucianism. So wherever the communism CCP is trying to do in China, it might affect a little bit everyday life of Chinese people, but the whole big tradition and their roots are so deep and so long that you cannot erase them. Well, at least I stand on this side, share Lee Kuan Yew on this point, but of course it's a very complicated problem, and whoever understands and knows China and its complexity, I know he's lying or he doesn't know what he's talking about, because it's a very difficult civilization to... You
know what you should do? You should speak to, if you could get the biographer of the Dalai Lama on here to talk about these issues. That might be someone who'd really be able to really have something important to say about it.
Oh, I try to bring him on.
Yeah, there's this guy Alex Norman. I mean, I don't know if you'll be able to get him. But
thank you, Ralph, for being on Common Sense and coming here and sharing all of this. And I'm very eager to read your book about the history of soul. And I do hope that you, the viewers of Common Sense, also sort of realize how complex those things are. And they touch every one of us, so they are not very distant, but on the other hand, very hard to comprehend. Thank you for watching our show. And I also thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense.